Okay, that's better. Sorry, it doesn't do it any good to put the big green card that says record if I leave it on the computer and ignore it. All right, so now we're recording. Oh man, you think I would get this thing right after so many, but apparently not. Okay, back to the screen share. Okay, so yeah, like I said, we'll revisit maybe at the end if people have some suggestions about ways we might have a sort of a sort of conference or a meeting just really to commemorate the work of some of these great people. I'd be open for suggestions. And then, so for the event, I will make it so you guys can't unmute yourselves here in a couple minutes for the talk. For those of you who've been coming to these and you saw the session with Carolina Sartorio, we had the Zoom bomb. It's the only one I've ever had, but we have to take some preemptive steps to keep people like that from hijacking our experience. So I'll do a little bit of that. Once the talk ends, if you have questions, you can use the hand raise icon, of course. All I ask is that if you're asking a question, just please leave your hand raised until the question's been completely resolved, because otherwise, if you put it down when Pamela is talking and giving you your response, you'll zoom somewhere else on her screen. And so for the consistency of the recording and everyone being able to see who's asking the question, just leave your hand up until the very end, and then you can put it down. That would be helpful. If for some reason she doesn't have the opportunity to answer all your questions, if you add it to the chat, like if you're not going to have a chance to ask it, you're going to leave. I'll make sure I'll make sure the speakers get these after the talk if there are such questions. So tonight's speaker. So Pamela Hieronymi has been a professor in UCLA's philosophy department since July of 2000. Her research sits at the intersection of many different subfields in philosophy, including ethics, philosophy of mind, and philosophy of action. Her publications concern moral responsibility, forgiveness, blame, and the kind of control we enjoy with respect to our own states of mind, especially our beliefs, intentions, and moral motivations. Her research has been supported by the American Council of Learned Societies, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Center for Advanced Study and the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University. She is currently working on a manuscript, Minds That Matter, that aims to resolve the traditional problem of free will and moral responsibility, thus reconciling human freedom and scientific explanation. In addition to her academic publications, Professor Hieronymi has appeared on Philosophy Talk Public Radio. Her thoughts on technology and teaching were published by the Chronicle of Higher Education. And much to all of my students in ethics and moral philosophy, much to their pleasure and satisfaction, she served as a consultant for NBC sitcom The Good Place, which my students have talked to me about many occasions over the last couple of years. So in connection with the latter, she's now entirely comfortable with the fact that everyone hates moral philosophers, except of course the students in classes where they talk about these things. They seem to love the kind of stuff that she talks about. So please join me in welcoming Professor Hieronymi. Give me a second to get everything pinned and get her pinned and me unpinned, and we'll get started. She's going to share her screen. So if you want to go ahead and do that, I'm going to remove myself. Sorry, one second.
Are you seeing the right screen? Or are you seeing? You're probably
yes, I'm seeing the right screen. I'm seeing your introductory Strawson's Ethical Naturalism with Defense screen.
Okay. Do you also see the little preview screen?
Oh yes, they say we can see the notes too.
Yeah. So let's see if I can make it so that it's just the one and not the other. But if I do that, that'll happen. Let's see. There. Does that seem right now?
Yes.
Okay. And then, do you have the link for the handout?
Yes. Do you want me? I'm just gonna upload it to the chat.
Awesome. This is going to be a multimedia extravaganza. There's going to be slides, which I almost never
love the extravaganzas
use.
Are perfect.
And I because I don't use slides, I like to make them look like a blackboard, and use Comic Sans or whatever that is. Let me see if it will advance. Did it just advance to a blank slide?
Yeah, hold on one sec.
Oh no, it advanced one too far. Okay, let's back up.
So I just put for everybody else, her handout was just added to the chat. So if you can't open that for some reason, let me know.
Let's see. Okay, there we go. Okay, so yeah, and then there's an extremely dense handout. You'll be surprised to know this paper is only 22 pages, despite the length of the handout. So most of it's on there. And with that, and the handout is on the Google Doc for you. But with that, I will get started. So I'm going to present here. I'm first going to present what I take to be Peter Strawson's social naturalism as applied to ethics. And I'm then going to briefly present the way in which that naturalism allows Strawson to resist skepticism about moral responsibility, as he argued in Freedom and Resentment. Strawson's way of resisting skepticism makes plain that his view is open to another challenge, namely that it's objectionably relativistic. I've provided a response to that challenge on his behalf in the final chapter of a recent book. And so today I'm going to expand on that response. So I'm going to begin with the presentation of Strawson's social naturalism as applied to ethics. Although the most thorough statement of it appears in his Skepticism and Naturalism, which is the publication of his 1982 Woodridge lectures, it can be seen in his much earlier Social Morality and Individual Ideal. In that article, he points out that the mere existence of a working human society itself ensures the existence of some system of rules which are typically followed. And I take it those are the minimal rules against murder, deceit, theft, and the like. A year later, in Freedom and Resentment, Strawson talks about a framework of expectation and demands that is given with the existence of society. Those expectations and demands, he says, are identical with our proneness to what he calls reactive attitudes, such as resentment, indignation, and gratitude. To better understand this, we need first to better understand what Strawson has in mind by reactive attitudes. We're now at 2C on the handout already. He identifies them by first noting what he calls a commonplace, namely, quote, the very great importance that we attach to the attitudes and intentions towards us of other human beings, and the great extent to which our personal feelings and reactions depend upon or involve our beliefs about those attitudes and intentions. To illustrate this, he points out, quote, if someone treads on my hand accidentally while trying to help me, the pain may be no less acute than if he treads on it in contemptuous disregard for my existence, or with the malevolent wish to injure me. But I shall generally feel in the second case a kind and degree of resentment that I shall not feel in the first. So to restate his commonplace, we care not only about how others affect us materially, so to speak, whether our hand is damaged, but also and often more about how others think about us. We care about how we figure into one another's worlds, the esteem or disesteem with which others hold us, whether they accord us a basic degree of respect and goodwill, and whether they guide their own behavior accordingly. More, the commonplace, the fact that we expect others to accord us a basic degree of respect and goodwill, is manifest in our reactions when those expectations are violated, manifest in the kind and degree of resentment that is felt when someone treads on your hand from contempt or disregard. That resentment is an example of what Strawson calls a reactive or participant attitude. It's an attitude that's a reaction to the quality of others' wills towards us as manifest in their behavior. The reactive attitudes contrast with what Strawson calls a more objective attitude, which need not be a reaction to a will, something like disappointment or frustration or relief. And I'm going to presume familiarity here with that contrast, which I'm sure you're familiar with. So we can then turn to examine the framework of expectations and demands that Strawson says is given with the fact of human society. Strawson's thought is that those expectations and demands, those norms or standards, are not norms that were in any way written down or given or chosen, but rather are identical to or of a piece with our readiness to react with this set of attitudes when those norms are violated. As Strawson says in Freedom and Resentment, the making of the demand is, the emphasis on is, the making of the demand is the proneness to the attitude. The relevant contrast here is not with a society with a different set of reactive attitudes, but rather with a society which utilized only some other way of establishing and securing widespread conformity with the minimal norms required for its existence. One that, say, utilized only a system of surveillance and sanction, rather than interpersonal reactions grounded in Strawson's commonplace. Such a society, I believe Strawson would say, would not be recognizably human. We can notice further that appeal to the commonplace, as opposed to surveillance and sanction, opens the door to what we might call moral rather than merely prudential reasoning. It allows us to guide our actions while thinking not merely about how it will impact our own interests, narrowly construed, but also how it will impact our relation to others. We can now surmise that the content of the demands in question, that is, what is demanded, will be given by the apt triggering conditions, so to speak, of this set of attitudes. And those triggering conditions concern the quality of another person's will. The quality of will to which your attitudes react just is another's willingness to heed the norms established by the reactive attitudes themselves, including their concern for how you perceive their quality of will. Now, put that way, the account might seem circular or empty. That's because we await a story about what gives content to the norms, a story about what goodwill or disregard amounts to. The structure I've sketched is entirely formal, but that's no count against it. The claim is rather that whatever the expectations and demands may be, avoid deceit, respect property, those expectations and demands are identical to a readiness to respond to the reactive attitudes should they be violated or exceeded, and their knowing violation amounts to a manifestation of ill will or disregard. Importantly, Strawson recognizes that the particular attitudes we adopt, resentment, say, rather than a special form of disappointment, are culturally contingent. The existence of a working society doesn't entail our particular system of attitudes. The view is not that parochial. Rather, the existence of a working society only ensures that there's some such system in place, something playing that role. So pulling those ideas together, we can see that Strawson offers us a picture of the natural form of human sociability. We're now at 2E. The existence of a functioning human society ensures the existence of a minimal framework or system of norms, where those norms are constituted by our proneness to the reactive attitudes. Our reactions are triggered by the quality of others' wills regarding those norms, that is, by showing respect or disrespect. We can say that society so understood is based on Strawson's commonplace, on a concern for respect. In fact, we can say that that commonplace grounds what we can call the human form of sociability. We live together and abide by a system of norms because we care about whether others respect us, whether others think that we respect them. That we care and so live is a natural fact, analogous to the fact that we use language or reason inductively. And so Strawson, as I'm interpreting him, is indulging in some armchair anthropology and sociology. And I will be drawn into that dubious practice myself in a moment. More, as a natural fact about us, our form of sociability, Strawson argues, is not itself open to skeptical doubts. And yet that form of sociability sets up a system within which justifications and criticisms can be made. More, the particulars of the system itself, its content, can be criticized and changed. It's only the fact that it takes this form, this human form, that's immune to doubt. And at this point, Strawson evokes Wittgenstein saying, quote, "It is difficult to begin at the beginning and not to try to go further back." Okay, so I'm now going to turn to freedom and resentment, where Strawson defends this form of sociability against one kind of doubt, namely that raised by the apparent incompatibility of free will and physical determinism. We're now at section 3. So the skeptic claims that if determinism is true, then we should not be engaged in this form of social interaction at all. If determinism is true, then we have reason to abandon the reactive attitudes. Or even if we can't abandon them, if we're stuck with them as a natural fact about our psychologies, we should at least acknowledge that we're trapped in an unjustifiable set of responses. Strawson's core reply, I argue, is simply to assert that our form of sociability, the fact that we live together in this way, reacting with these attitudes, is a natural fact about us, and so not the sort of thing that can be shown to be unjustified. To think otherwise, according to Strawson, would be somewhat like thinking that under certain conditions, we would have reason to stop using induction. Such a doubt, he says, is idle. But importantly, again, this is not to say that the particulars within the system can't be shown to be unjustified or illicit. But the fact that the particulars within the system can be shown to be unjustified or illicit seems to open a route for the skeptic that's often called the generalization strategy. The skeptic can argue that certain conditions that within the system show it unjustified to hold some people responsible will, if determinism is true, be true of everyone all the time. So those already recognized conditions will generalize. So for example, it seems to be inappropriate to hold someone responsible for their impulsive behavior if that impulsive behavior is due to an inhibitory control disorder. And the skeptic argues that if determinism is true, then everyone is always in the relevant way, like the person who is subject to the inhibitory control disorder. Okay, now what is that relevant way? Here, answers vary from skeptic to skeptic, but roughly it's that our behavior is explained by our physiology, or is out of our control, or is not up to us, or has a source outside of us. By understanding this already recognized case in a way that will generalize if determinism is true, the skeptic can argue that if determinism is true, the system is unjustified on its own terms, so to speak. It condemns itself from within. Strawson does not agree. So in Freedom and Resentment, he argues against this possibility in an interesting but difficult to follow way. And now we're at 3D. He grants that the system contains within it certain conditions under which we cease to interact with others in the ordinary way, cases in which I will say the quality of a person's will ceases to matter. Though importantly, I don't mean ceases to matter full stop, but ceases to matter in the sense that we cease to react to it in the usual way and move to a more objective attitude. So these are cases in which of what has been come to be called in the literature exemption, though I've come to think that that's a misleading and somewhat dangerous label. Strawson lists 3 classes of such cases. The first are cases of abnormal circumstances, like having a bad day or being under great stress. He dismisses those quickly. The second sort of case, quote, allows that the circumstances were normal, but presents the agent as psychologically abnormal or as morally undeveloped, end quote. These are cases of mental illness, unfortunate formative circumstances, and immaturity. Then, having presented those first 2 classes of cases, he notes what he calls something curious to add to this. Namely, that we sometimes step away from the reactive attitudes on purpose, so to speak, and we do that for a variety of reasons. He says, quote, the objective attitude is not only something we naturally tend to fall into in cases of abnormality or immaturity, it's also something which is available as a resource in other cases too. We can sometimes look with something like the same objective eye on the behavior of the normal and the mature. We have this resource and we sometimes use it as a refuge, say, from the strains of involvement, or as an aid to policy, or simply out of intellectual curiosity. End quote. So when we use our resource, we do not, as he puts it, naturally fall into the objective attitude, but we adopt it for various purposes, more or less at will. And I think that's a familiar part of life. It's what happens when someone becomes an issue, as in, oh, him, he's another issue altogether. Okay, so notice that when Strawson characterizes the cases that we do naturally fall into, the objective attitudes, he does so by noting what's normal, abnormal, immature, or undeveloped. He later characterizes these as cases in which a person is incapacitated in some or all respects for ordinary interpersonal relationships. By ordinary, I've argued in my book, Strawson means something like statistically ordinary. And it's on that basis that he can argue against the generalization strategy. And that's the surprising part about my interpretation. Right? So he can argue against the generalization strategy because, as he puts it, quote, it cannot be a consequence of any thesis, which is not itself self-contradictory, that abnormality is the usual condition. Cannot be a consequence of any thesis that is not itself self-contradictory, that abnormality is the usual condition. So here's how I see the argument going. Given that the cases in which we exempt are those in which the person is not capable of statistically ordinary interpersonal relating, we know in advance that nothing true of all of us will be a reason to exempt. Not only because we already know that most of us are so capable, but also because it could not be the case that everyone is an outlier. Notice that we can now provide a kind of diagnosis of what went wrong with the generalization strategy. When we exempt, in the case of, for example, someone with an inhibitory control disorder, our reason for doing so is not that the person's behavior is determined in some way that might be true of all of us. Rather, our reason for doing so is that the person's behavior is determined in such a way as to make it the case that the person is not capable of ordinary interpersonal relating across that range of behavior. So the generalization the strategist has misidentified the relevant way. So Strawson's picture here provides, I think, a fascinating way to argue against the generalization strategy, and one that requires some reflection. So I'm going to now examine the underlying picture. We're now at 3E on the handout. Notice that his picture seems to imply that as what is ordinary changes, so will not only the exempting conditions, but also the demands and expectations themselves, what I'll call the standards of regard. And in fact, I think that implication is plausible. So to illustrate, consider drunkenness. Drunkenness is, in our society, a condition under which we often shift to more objective attitudes. But suppose that everyone in our society was naturally equipped with only that degree of inhibitory control, attention, and memory that we now exhibit when fairly intoxicated. In such a society, our expectations of and interactions with one another would look from the outside much the same as our current expectations of and interactions with people who are fairly drunk. We wouldn't respond to certain outbursts with indignation or resentment. We wouldn't expect that our requests would be reliably remembered. We wouldn't expect certain indulgences to be resisted. But notice it wouldn't be the case that we would then be treating everyone as we now treat the drunken. We wouldn't be suspending all the time the usual expectations and demands, taking up a more detached, objective attitude, and so overlooking constant disregard and disrespect. Rather, in this society, certain behaviors that we now normally regard as disrespectful, but which we might overlook given intoxication, would then simply be an unremarkable part of life. They would not be considered disrespectful. And that is to say, in this society, the content of the expectations and demands would have shifted. Thus, it seems, if we were all to lose some of our ability to self-regulate, and so become as we are now when fairly intoxicated, the expectations and demands to which we hold one another would adjust. Certain things that we now regard as rude or disrespectful would cease to be so. The standards would shift to accommodate our new limitations. And we can note that this picture allows for subcultures with different standards of regard, perhaps elementary school classrooms, homes for the memory impaired, frat houses, finishing schools, or the mafia. The standards of regard, that is to say, proneness to the reactive attitudes, can shift with the population. But that shiftiness, of course, raises the specter of relativism. But before taking up that objection, I want to revisit how it allows Strawson to foil the generalization strategy. On his picture, though we sometimes exempt, we couldn't always have reason to exempt everyone because, given our natural human commitment to engaged interpersonal relating, we have reason to exempt only an outlier or unusual cases. And we can support that thought with two thoughts. First, given our commitment to engaged relating, any condition true of everyone would be accommodated by a shift in our expectations, and so it wouldn't give us reason to exempt. Contrawise, if we were to exempt everyone, that would amount to dropping all demands and expectations, and so exiting the natural form of human sociability, which we couldn't have reason to do. And so no internal conditions on our proneness to the reactive attitudes is going to generalize. Our natural commitment to ordinary relating means not only that we will not exempt everyone, but also that the framework given by human sociability will not give us reason to do so. The skeptical doubt is thus idle. Now, of course, the idea that we will accommodate anything true of everyone with a shift in the standards opens the picture to a charge of objectionable relativism. It implies that behavior will cease to be disrespectful simply because it's widespread. So now I'm going to turn and try to address the charge of relativism, and we're now at 4 on the handout. We can begin by noting that not all relativism is objectionable. I believe shifts to accommodate natural limitations would not be objectionable, and some sort of relativism is important to accommodate cultural variations in social standards. But some forms of relativism are objectionable, and to avoid them, a picture of the nature of morality must, at a minimum, allow certain moral claims to have what I will call critical purchase. That is to say, a picture of the nature of morality must not merely accurately describe social norms and their workings, but must also both allow critical evaluation of those norms and leave open the possibility that the norms could be properly criticized, even if widespread or dominant. And mere descriptions, such as those that might be offered by an anthropologist or a sociologist, don't offer critical purchase. They say only that some action, attitude, or practice is, say, disrespectful in culture A, while the same may be respectful in culture B. And those relativized descriptions don't allow the members of the two cultures to disagree across culture about whether something really is disrespectful, because the respectful has been ascribed only on the basis of what in fact occurs in a given society. So insofar as the standards of regard adjust to what's statistically ordinary, they might seem to be objectionably relativistic in this way. And an acceptable picture of the nature of morality has to avoid that relativism by allowing for both critical evaluation of the norms of society and leaving open the possibility that they could be criticized even when widespread or dominant. And I'm going to now argue that Strawson's picture can allow for critical purchase. Okay, so how to secure critical purchase? Strawson himself frequently mentions consistency, and appeals to consistency can take us some distance, providing some critical purchase. It's a Kantian hope that they will take us the whole distance, providing adequate critical purchase, but I do not share that hope. So instead, I will suggest a simple and unapologetic appeal to ideals. That is, to the kind of thing that Strawson had in mind when writing Social Morality, an Individual Ideal. So to see that response, let us first review the picture. And now I'm going to start using the slides. So let me move things around a little bit. So the picture includes, whoa, that is not what I want. It's going to be a little tricky for me. Okay. So the picture includes the standards of regard, that is, the norms that are identical to the premise of reactive attitudes, and it includes the exempting, or as I will now refer to them, the exit conditions. Those are the conditions under which participant relating becomes unworkable, which are also the conditions under which the quality of a will no longer matters in the usual way. That is to say, under which we cease to react. Individuals exit when they lack the capacity for tolerably ordinary interpersonal relating. As we've seen, those cases must be rare, and this is so for two reasons. First, if the exiting conditions were universal, we would, by exiting everyone, abandon human society altogether. And that's something we both would not do and could not have reason to do. Second, if a so-called demand or expectation is rarely reacted to, it thereby ceases to be a demand or expectation. The standards will shift. And we can next distinguish between the minimal standards of regard required for the functioning society, and that's what I meant to put up now, which we have said must be typically satisfied for the existence of any society, and the actual standards of regard at work across a society, which are typically above the minimal. We can further distinguish the actual standards of regard at work in portions of a society. And we can now consider the threat of relativism in some detail. And we're now at 5B3 on the handout. So in Strawson's picture, there's a kind of limit, which I'm going to call delta 1, which ensures that the actual standards of regard will shift in response to the typical capacities of the population to ensure that the exit conditions are rare. And I'm using little delta because it's not exactly a difference. It's not something we could get by subtraction, or that we could measure in units. And call it little delta. Okay. So problematically, it seems that what we might call moral capacities could undergo a widespread change for the worse. After all, as a naturalist, Strawson should think that those capacities can be naturally or contingently limited, just as capacities for memory or inhibitory control can be naturally or contingently limited. Moral development, after all, takes time and can go badly, and some people, I'm afraid, arrive at adulthood too frail of ego, too insensitive or too bigoted to satisfy the current standards of regard. And so there's no reason to think that an entire society might not slide downwards, so that eventually disrespect is no longer disrespectful, no longer something to react to with resentment or indignation. Though the minimal standards will provide a kind of floor beyond which human society will not exist. So delta 1, together with the changeability of our capacities, generates the threat of relativism. A widespread change in capacities could, it seems, render disrespect no longer disrespectful. To address this threat, I suggest a simple and unapologetic appeal to ideals. Ideals might include such things as equality, piety, the stewardship of nature, or avoiding pain in sentient creatures. And with the ideals will come another set of standards, the standards of regard that would adequately embody or do right by some ideal. Such ideals will be essentially contested and will be essentially contestable and will be contested. To call something an ideal is not yet to call it a good ideal, but to call it an ideal is to say it's the sort of thing that's meant to be a good ideal. And the possibility of ideals will allow for critical purchase, because we're no longer merely describing what's actual. We can criticize it. An ideal of equality, say, would allow us to criticize the actual standards. And to the extent that the ideal can be understood by others, it would also allow genuine disagreement. Now that's going to seem all too easy, and two objections can be raised. First, one might object that the ideals as I've introduced them are not yet sufficient for critical purchase. For that, we would have to know which are the correct ideals. And to show them correct, we need an argument that grounds them elsewhere, in God or in human nature or in reason, or perhaps an argument that shows them unavoidable. Now that objection misunderstands what I believe is required for critical purchase. For that, we don't have to know which ideals are correct. We only need ideals to be something in which we have confidence, on the basis of which we could aptly, if ultimately incorrectly, evaluate and criticize an entire society. And for that, it's sufficient if they are contestable. They're the kind of thing that might be correct. But that much is true of any purported ideal. Now, the objector might now think that critical purchase, as I'm understanding it, is insufficient to meet the threat of relativism. But I disagree. It's insufficient to eliminate our fallibility, to be sure. But the threat of widespread and pervasive error is not the threat of objectionable relativism, nor is relativism itself a form of skepticism. So as long as we're not skeptical of our own ideals, they will suffice for critical purchase, even if we don't ground them elsewhere. The second objection is that the simple pointing to ideals is too weak or bloodless, too much of a solution by fiat. We're now pointing to some pie-in-the-sky thing that has been cut loose from the recognizably moral attitudes and expectations of society. And I agree, and so therefore I'm going to move on to an expanded strategy, now at 5C. So to start the examination of the strategy, we can ask why there's a limit like delta 1 by focusing on the interpersonal dynamic highlighted by Strawson now in some detail. So those are stick people with very large heads. They are looking at one another. So here, person D, the doer, has some quality of will towards R, the reactor, and R reacts to the quality of D's will, or more accurately, to R's belief about the quality of D's will towards R, with reactive attitude 1. Let's say that R resents D. But the story does not stop there. D, in turn, reacts to R's reactive attitude, RA1, or more precisely to D's belief about R's reactive attitude with reactive attitude 2. Maybe D is indignant that R should resent him. And of course, R can now react to D's reaction to R's reaction, and this can go on to exhaustion. So notice that the green horizontal interactions here are matters of perception and belief, which can be evaluated for accuracy. Meanwhile, the yellow vertical developments, the reactions had on the basis of those perceptions or beliefs, both embody and manifest the individual's operative standards of regard. And demands of rationality or interpersonal consistency generate the yellow brackets. Notice too that in this case, with D's indignation at R's resentment, rather than D feeling guilt or remorse, these individuals' operative standards of regard are out of alignment. And the situation between D and R is uncomfortable. And that discomfort is a manifestation of Strawson's commonplace. Again, we care both about the quality of others' wills and about their perception of our quality of will. We don't want them to violate standards of regard, nor do we want them to think that we have done so. And that commonplace generates at least three kinds of pressure. First, and most obviously, it generates pressure to meet the standards of regard, or failing that, to present yourself as having done so. Second, it generates pressure for uniform standards of regard, because disagreement about the standards generates the conflict depicted. Third, Strawson's commonplace, that is our natural form of sociability, leaves us vulnerable to what Strawson calls the strains of involvement. We can only tolerate so much disregard, malice, indifference, indignation, outrage, failure to understand, or failure of empathy before we feel pressure to use our resource and adopt a more objective attitude. Often enough, we also generate a story, theory, ideology, or diagnosis about the other that allows us to more easily use our resource, to more easily interact with them in a more objective way. And that third kind of pressure, the strains of involvement, pushes us away from participant engagement and towards the objective attitudes. But as we've seen, a widespread lack of reaction simply amounts to a change in the standards of regard. So because our tolerance of interpersonal conflict is limited, and because a widespread failure to react to the so-called violations will result in a shift of the standards, we encounter Delta 1. The actual standards must be such that our relationships are tolerably workable, given the typical capacities. If the typical capacities drop, the standards must drop, and if the standards rise, the typical capacities must also rise. And so we end up with something close to ought implies can, but now applied with a very broad brush at the level of society on the whole. Okay, to examine in more detail how this picture is not objectionably relativistic, we can next distinguish between what I'm going to call the naturally given limitations, such as our natural capacities for memory, attention, or inhibition control, and what we might call socially malleable limitations, such as our ability to lose gracefully or avoid xenophobia, delay gratification, or respect women. That distinction isn't an easy one to draw, and maybe all limitations in the end are socially malleable. That's not going to be a problem for this picture, but it's easier to start with the idea that there's some naturally fixed limitations. So let's start there and then examine in a bit more detail how a natural limitation in our capacity for, say, delay of gratification will shift the actual standards downward. So suppose that as our capacity for delay of gratification slips downward, you, as a would-be reformer, try to hold out against that shift. You hold on to an ideal of self-control. That ideal will, in this example, dictate a set of standards, ones that are above the ones tied by Delta 1 to the natural limits. You now have a few options. First, you could continue to engage with others, reacting with resentment, indignation, and the like, as would fit those higher standards. It will be personally, emotionally costly, as those negative reactive attitudes are personally exhausting. It'll be interpersonally costly, as it will generate interpersonal conflict. And eventually, it will lead to you being dismissed by others. The dismissal of the would-be reformer reveals what we might call a set of upper exit conditions. Now, how or why would you be dismissed? Well, if you can yourself satisfy the higher standards of regard, you are going to be regarded as gifted but ungenerous, and therefore not to be taken seriously. If you can't yourself satisfy the higher standards, you're going to be regarded as hypocritical, and so not to be taken seriously. And either way, others will end up using their resource and or telling stories, and you will end up at best a kind of irritating curiosity with a weird hangup. If you understand the ineffectiveness of your engagement, you might choose instead to use your resource yourself while maintaining your belief in the correctness of the higher standards. But now we're going to encounter the earlier objection. This bloodless reaction will seem like you're not really committed to the ideals. You're not serious about them. You hold them only in name. We can think here of the position I believe many people find themselves in with respect to the treatment of animals. In either case, whether you engage and continue to react or instead use your resource while expressing your beliefs, you might make arguments. However, given that the limitation in self-control is by stipulation a natural one, your arguments will seem unreasonable. And so it seems that holding out for expectations that exceed the natural limitations will be neither sustainable, effective, or reasonable. The standards will move downward to meet the limitations. Okay, so now let us turn to what I have called the socially malleable limitations, and so replace the capacity to delay gratification with the capacity to respect those in some subjugated group. So suppose again that as a would-be reformer, you try to hold out against that shift. Let us say you're holding out for an ideal of equality. That ideal will again dictate a set of standards above the actual. And as before, you might continue to engage, reacting to the violations of the standard with resentment and indignation. And again, that will be difficult given the commonplace. It will be personally, emotionally costly, as those negative reactive attitudes are exhausting, and it will be interpersonally costly as it will generate conflict. And eventually, it will lead to you being dismissed by others or worse. You will again encounter the upper exit conditions. Others will end up using their resource, telling stories, and you will end up at best an irritating curiosity, or more likely a target of exile or of violence. Now, alternatively, you might try to use your resource while asserting your beliefs. But again, that will seem like believing without caring, being committed only in name. But in this case, there may also be significant counterpressure that makes the difficulty of holding out more sustainable. The counterpressure might come from one's commitment to the ideal itself, or from one's self-interest, or from the demands of self-respect. It's been noted that resentment or some such reaction may be required for self-respect and may function socially as a kind of protest. And a different sort of counterpressure will be available if you're not alone, if there's a sub-community of reformers. Such a sub-community will not only offer support to its members, but will also make it somewhat more costly and difficult for the larger society to exempt or dismiss the entire sub-community, given the pressures of the commonplace. Doing so will amount to and require dehumanizing an entire class of people. Meanwhile, within the sub-community, the standards may change, and there may appear then in the larger society what we can call reforming standards, now above the actual standards, but below the upper exit conditions. These are standards of regard that challenge the status quo, but can be tolerated, though with difficulty and conflict. And the reformers can, again, make arguments. And in this case, the arguments might have some purchase with some people. First, because the limitations are socially malleable, it may be that the cost to those hurt by the status quo is greater than the cost to others to make the change, which would render the reforming standards reasonable in the sense of fair. If we presume a commitment to live together while treating each person and their interests symmetrically, a change would be required by that commitment. It'll then be difficult to argue against the change without either dehumanizing or else relying on metaphysics or ideology to generate spurious distinctions between, say, women and men or races or what have you. I think that appeal to fairness is a way in which the commitment to the commonplace may have fairness baked in, so to speak, as a kind of special value, though I don't know how to argue that fully. So alternatively, it may be that the ideal itself, say an ideal of beauty or ecological integrity or avoiding the torture of sentient creatures, may be compelling enough reason to make the social change, rendering the expectation reasonable in a sense that appeals to the ideal rather than to fairness. So in either case, it may be that the upward pressure can render the reforming standards both reasonable and sustainable. Whether they will be effective, of course, depends on whether and how the non-reformers respond, whether they're moved by the claims of consistency or empathy or by the ideal, or whether they are, as individuals, simply replaced over time. That sometimes happens, and then the socially malleable limitations will shift upward, so to speak, to better satisfy the standards. Okay, so we can now zoom out and consider the pressures at work in slightly more detail. We've seen that there's another kind of exit limit similar to D1 between the actual standards and the upper exit conditions. I'm going to call that D2. And we've seen that the commonplace generates pressure towards uniformity in the standards. We can call that pressure D3. We can add to that a kind of intrapersonal pressure that the standards of rationality, or of what is sometimes called fit, will generate pressure to align the reforming standards, that is to say, one's own reactions with the ideal. So distance there is the sort of thing experienced by those of us who find factory farming unspeakable and yet fail to react emotionally and interpersonally in a way that matches our beliefs. You can call that D4. Finally, looking at the same thing in a slightly different format, the items in the center here in white are aspects of Strawson's picture. The facts that Strawson noted in his commonplace generate pressure to keep the standards uniform and satisfied. Because those pressures and limits are generated by the commonplace, by our caring about how others think about us, I'm going to call them horizontal, even though the lines there are curved because of vertical pressures to keep those narrow. The fact that we live in that envelope, so to speak, created by the commonplace, that's what Strawson takes to be a natural fact. But the envelope itself might move up and down vertically. So I've added to Strawson's picture the possibility of vertical pressures, coming not only from natural limitations, but also from ideals, and we can now add from self-interest and from differences of power that might be exploited to advance one's interests. As I mentioned, I suspect fairness has a special place here. Okay, so though this is all painfully and embarrassingly armchair sociology and anthropology, it does seem to me to fairly accurately capture certain dynamics that I take to be actual. And if something like it is possible, then ideals can be incorporated into the reforming standards of regard in a way that allows critical purchase to be more than pie in the sky or bloodless abstraction. What we can rightly call morality can have within it the resources to evaluate and criticize social norms and workings of an entire society, not just as an ideal pointed to only in name, but as part of morality itself. Okay, there's of course going to be objections to this dynamic picture. It might be objected that this dynamic of pressure and counter pressure puts further and very significant burdens on the already disadvantaged and is therefore unjust. Alas, I have no answer to that. It seems to me that it is so. It seems to me a sorry consequence of our sorry condition. The other big objection is going to be that morality and the reforming standards of regard are still socially and historically contingent, and that is true. It seems to me, though, that some of the urgency of the reformers' efforts can be well understood by the genuine contingency of the standards. And further, that historical contingency is, of course, one way in which the picture is naturalistic. It understands both the reactive attitudes and the social norms they constitute to be a product of our natural contingent history. It could, I think, even understand the ideals in that way, while still insisting that the ideals remain both essentially contestable and possibly correct. Such a picture is not merely descriptive, it's not simply social science, insofar as it allows that the system described can be criticized and can incorporate into itself those ideals. Strawson thinks that the picture limits the possible ways of questioning our way of life, because he thinks we could not have reason to exit our natural form of sociability. So adopting Wiggins' phrase for what I suspect is a very similar position, I would call this a sensible naturalism. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. Hold on one second. All right. Let's see. So I will, if you want to leave the slides up, or do you want to take them down? It's up to you. It might leave them up because people may have questions that will be
Okay.
easier to.
Sure.
So if you have a question, raise your hand and we'll start that way. Okay, well, I'll raise my hand. I'll raise my own hand, I suppose. So I had a question about sort of a background. This is maybe a way of thinking about how to conceptualize the debate between compatibilists and the way that Frankfurt's sometimes used in those debates, or the way that Strawson sometimes used in those debates. And it is one way of doing this, like what you want to say more generally, is that in some ways free will is just going to be whatever capacities are required or get implicated in the shape, the unique shape that the human form of sociability happens to take at particular times and places. And so free will is just going to be whatever is required to make this kind of system work. Is that, or it's like it's I don't know if that makes sense, but or do we need to talk about free will at all? So why can't we just talk about the sort of like you gave a whole talk, and then we don't have to talk about, at no moment do we talk about free will. And so I wonder what role you think that plays in the debate, or in trying to flesh out this part of Strawson's naturalism, which I find very plausible, even if I don't know how to situate it within the debate that we might have. Yeah.
Yeah, great. So I take it that one of the things Strawson agrees with the pessimist about is that the pessimist would understand freedom as susceptibility to influence, right? So if I can, by punishing you, make life go better, right? If I can, as a consequentialist, influence you by punishing you and rewarding you, that's what matters. And so freedom then becomes this other thing. And Strawson agrees with the pessimist that that's conceptually shocking. But then, what role does freedom have in Strawson's own picture? I suspect that that it's going to become well, sorry. Let me not try to say what role it has in his own picture. Let me try to say what I think, because
Yes.
I have a better grip on that. So I suspect that if by what we mean by freedom is that capacity, with the having of which renders us morally responsible, or that capacity, the having of which puts us in control of ourselves in such a way that we can rightly be held morally responsible, then I think there is no such thing. if we mean, and I think that because I think the kind of agency for which we are held responsible is ultimately our answering of questions, our ability to make decisions. And it's not our being in control of ourselves that makes us responsible. It's the fact that we matter to other people in a certain way. So I'm sort of quickly going through a paper I wrote called Reflection and Responsibility, which said that what makes us responsible isn't our ability to step back and control ourselves. What makes us responsible is our ability to stand in certain sorts of interpersonal relationships. And once we can stand in those relationships, our activities can take on a certain significance that that the activities of other creatures who might enjoy the same form of agency don't have, because they don't stand in the same social relations. But that doesn't mean that freedom, that the word freedom it has no role to play, because there's lots of different ways in which we're concerned about freedom ethically. There's lots of different points at which an ability to do otherwise, or an adequate opportunity to avoid, or a lack of hindrance, or a lack of manipulation is extremely important. But those, I think, are going to be different kinds of ethical concerns that arise in different kinds of ethical situations, not a sort of single fundamental underlying thing that renders us that puts us in these relations to begin with.
Yeah, that sounds right. Oh, good. Okay. So now there's some other questions. So Daniel Cohen, your hand is on top of my screen.
Right, thank you. So I'm just thinking about Strawson's reply to the generalization strategy. So the idea is that say people suffering from addiction, you might say, well, we exempt them from responsibility. And then given the truth of determinism, supposedly, we're all actually relevantly similar to addicts, therefore we should all be exempted. So that's maybe the classical version of the exemption strategy. And then Strawson's reply is that that doesn't make any sense, because it doesn't, it's almost a semantic point that to be exempted is for the, is to be treated contrary to the statistical norms or something like that.
Yes,
Okay. Is that
the
about
cases
right?
the cases in which we exempt are the outlier cases.
Exactly. It can't be that we're all outliers. Is that the key
Right.
point? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So I thought that there's a way to resuscitate the generalization strategy. So you could say, yeah, the proponents of that view should kind of back away from that. They should say, yeah, sure. Which obviously it doesn't make sense to say that we should all be exempted. Nevertheless, the norms should be updated so that we just so that the norms don't legitimately apply to addicts. The norm shouldn't legitimately apply to anyone. The norm requiring self-control in some context. So it's not. So you should make the same point, but you just avoid saying everyone should be exempted. Yeah, and I think it's there in your map somewhere. But isn't that a way of resuscitating the generalization strategy, that if we're all relevantly similar to addicts, given the truth of determinism, it follows that the norms should be updated such that everyone should be treated in relevantly similarly to addicts?
Well, so there's three different. Yeah, there's three different. So Strawson's going to put pressure on whether we're relevantly similar, right? So he's going to think that the reason why we exempt addicts is not because of anything about them that could generalize. Rather, the reason why we exempt them is because they are incapacitated for tolerably ordinary interpersonal relationships. And it couldn't be that everyone is incapacitated for tolerably ordinary interpersonal relationships. Now, you might have in mind a different kind of objection. But, well, sorry, maybe I should let you respond to that first. Or do you want me to give you what I thought
keep on going. This is helpful.
Okay. so there's a different kind of objection that I deal with in the book that I didn't bring up here, which is without trying to connect it to, without trying to go through the whole connection, it's roughly this. Look, Strawson, these norms are a product of human culture, and human culture has for centuries thought of ourselves as contra-causal free spirits inhabiting the material world. And the norms grew up around that assumption, and that assumption turned out to be false. And so, you know, this is a different kind of way into the generalization strategy. So we have, in fact, been exempting people not because they were incapacitated for tolerably ordinary relationships, but because they aren't free in this contra-causal immaterial way. So, you know, you just don't have you're not getting the norms right, is what this person might say. So, whereas Strawson does seem to have this kind of optimism that the norms are going to, you know, be workable all the time. So to think about that, I introduce an analogy, and the analogy is in a nearby possible world where they play a game very much like baseball. However, in that nearby possible world, they have a clearly written down rule book where they say, in which it says that if any performance enhancing drug has been used during a game, that game does not count. The stats don't matter. Everything is wiped out. And it says very clearly that a performance enhancing drug is any substance that enhances player performance at the long-term cost of player health. And then it's learned that chewing tobacco satisfies the definition of a performance enhancing drug, and there's always been chewing tobacco in every game that's ever been played. So that's supposed to like map this same thing, that like all along our rules have built into them this false assumption. We come to see that this assumption is false. And so the incompatibilist now wants to say, you know, the equivalent of, there has never been a game of baseball. The rules are unwind, you know, are destroying it from within. Strawson's response to that, I believe, is to say, is the analog of saying, no. At the very same time that we learned that chewing tobacco satisfies the definition of a performance enhancing drug, we also learned that we got that rule wrong, that we wrote it down wrong. That our rule needs to be refined. We didn't, you know, we were confused about the rule. And the way this shows up in his work, there's a footnote. I don't have a handy where it is, but he sometimes will talk about the philosophical accretions that that sort of stick like barnacles onto our ideas, right? So he's going to think of of our presumptions about contra-causal freedom as just these like accretions that we need to sort of clear off our ideas, and then we will find underneath this well-working system that he believes he is showing us turns on whether you have the capacity for ordinary interpersonal relationships. Now, I myself find that weirdly optimistic. So, here's what I think instead. I think if we find ourselves in that point of having figured out that that chewing tobacco matches the definition of a performance enhancing drug, we're now in a moment of crisis. We don't, so one thing we might do is decide that there's never been a game, but we don't have to decide that. Nothing says we have to go that direction, right? We could go that direction. We could go Strawson's direction and decide that we've misunderstood the rules. In this case, I think we could go for like a GRU kind of, like up until this point, it's been like this, but from this point forward, we're gonna, right? So I think it's just now up to us to figure out what to do. So I think of that as my more existentialist reaction to the possibility of that discovery.
Yeah, that's very helpful. So I suppose at least it's not incoherent to concede and say, look, we've never played a game of baseball. So that's one way in which the generalization strategy is not incoherent. In the way that Strawson says that, oh yeah, the idea that we should all be exempted is kind of almost a contradiction. There's a way of reconstructing that so that it's coherent, but it's not the only possibility, is the response I take it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he's not going to concede that it's coherent. But that depends on presuming this picture of how we get at what the rules are. Right. And I don't fully understand that aspect of his picture, right? So I don't know that I can, but it does seem to me, I mean, this comes out in, I deal with this a little bit in the book. It comes out in this argument he gives where it's clear that he's thinking that what matters is not our beliefs about when people are and aren't exempted, but like the truth about it. And I think if you grant him that, it becomes incoherent. But if you keep it to be our beliefs about it, then it's not incoherent to think that this could be true.
Thanks.
So Derek, your hand was up and then down and then back up. So you're not next on the screen, but you were the next originally. So if you're still wanting to be in the queue, you're on deck. So let's do your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. So yeah, I was trying to really articulate what I was trying to ask. So that's why I go up and down. But
No
thanks.
worries.
So I'm not sure whether my question is well articulated. Probably not. So I'll just throw it out there. I take the issue of relativism is that if we appeal to a standard appeal to the statistical normal, the problem is like if everybody's doing something terrible, we don't want to shift our standard to meet them because society could be terrible. So I'm wondering whether this is a parallel problem or maybe it's not a problem. Is that like sometimes some people could do something exceptionally good beyond the norm. We don't want to say, well, therefore it doesn't count as goodness of the will, or just because they are exceptionally different from everybody else. So it's kind of parallel in a way. But at the same time, whereas in the case of people, society that's terrible, we don't want to shift our standard to meet them. Similar in this case, we don't want our society to shift our moral standard to meet the exceptional moral saint, because that's what supererogation is. Like these people are exceptionally good. We praise them, but we don't want to raise the bar. We say that they're doing something beyond the duty. It's the fact that they're a saint doesn't mean that we raise the bar to expect and demand the same for everybody else. So it seems that this is a case where we want to make sense of the fact how there could be goodness beyond the statistical norm. Yeah, please. Sorry.
So, I mean, some of what you're saying seems to me just to be actual, right? So there are some people who are kind of, crappy and they disrespect a lot of people. And then there's some people who are really great and they go above and beyond what we want, what we expect. And that's just describing like life. The worry raised by the thought that the standards are fixed by what's actual is the worry that if you were looking at a society in which everyone was super insensitive, say, or super biased or super chauvinistic, then because the standards are fixed by what's actual, there won't be anything wrong with that society. You won't have any ability to say that what they're doing is wrong. And you could do the reverse, right? So it does seem to me that if everyone became if we had much better memories and much better abilities to control ourselves and were much more sensitive, maybe what now seems like an extremely thoughtful gesture would just become expected, and not doing it would be rude, right? Things could shift in that direction. as
Yeah, I guess
well.
that's my question is like, do we want to say that our standard should switch to that direction? Because I thought part of the idea of supererogation is that we don't want to praise them while at the same time shifting our standard to make it a universal demand, right? We want to hold our standard as it is while accepting that they are good, right? Is
Yeah,
it not
so that's what,
kind of good
right.
does not shift the standard?
So for
Maybe
any given set of standards of regard in a society or sub-society, there's going to be the possibility of going above and beyond. And that's going to be that's going to elicit gratitude. I think that's what gratitude is doing, right? Is sort of noting the above and beyond. Now, if everybody's capacities shift, that doesn't do away with the possibility of gratitude any more than it does away with of things that merit gratitude any more than it would do away with the possibility of things that merit resentment. Those are just going to be the things that fall on either side of where the current standards are. So even if the standard shifted upward, you could still just have a new idea of what counts as supererogatory. You wouldn't give up on the category of supererogatory.
I see. Yeah. Thank you very much. Maybe I thought supererogation is slightly different, but I thought the standard would not shift. But yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Okay, Daniel, you're next.
All right, thanks so much for this. It was fascinating. So make sure that I understand something and just make a suggestion, and also just clarify the objection from Injustice. So you said at one point you just want to sort of bite the bullet. Alas, we're in a sorry state. To the objection that says, where is this now? 5D, I believe, 5D1. The dynamic of counterpressure puts further burdens that are disadvantaged. And you just say unjust. That's just the way it is. Well, so consider moral progress. I mean, that resulted in the discovery of human rights, the enforcement of human rights. So we don't just place pressure on keeping standards uniform. It seems like there's also deep, like immense pressure on challenging existing standards. And I wonder here if there's an interesting case of a dynamic tension between preserving and also challenging the existing standards. So you have both the preservation and the challenges that come from us as we are, rather than from, well, it doesn't require, of course, contra-causal freedom. It's compatible with no one being able to have ever done otherwise, also compatible with, determinism, consistent set of abilities to do otherwise. The idea is that we get both the challenge to the existing standards and the pressure to keep those existing standards, and this interesting dynamic tension between those two pressures. And we get all of this without regards for the metaphysics of the free will debate. As I put it in Strawson-friendly terms, though I don't necessarily endorse this myself, the idea would be this kind of thing shows really why the metaphysics of libertarianism, the free will debate, and so on are relevant to the concerns underlying our responsibility practices. Anyway, so I think both the objection itself, of course, I'm sure you had to go through this fairly quickly for time considerations, but I think both the objection itself about the disadvantaged and the response to it, I just think there's a lot more that could come from your model. It could get really interesting. But anyway, yeah, this was great. Thank you so much.
So I'm not sure so the objection, as I was understanding the objection, is the problem is it looks like the moral standards are now just being read off what's statistically normal, and that means that this is going to be objectionably relativistic. My reply was, no, you can appeal to ideals, and as long as we have confidence in our ideals, we can criticize the standards. And then there was another objection that said, what are ideals? You're just pointing to some abstract thing. And then I said, well, no, there are these familiar dynamics of pressure and counterpressure by which people can criticize the standards at work in their society and can in fact change, those standards can in fact change. And then there was this objection that says basically, Hieronymi, your way of saving us from relativism means that the oppressed people have to do all of this hard work to get their claims recognized. They're going to have to be the ones who are out there fighting for reform and for their own status and standing. And that's the thing to which I said, yeah, that seems like the way it is.
Right. Sorry. Yeah. And then just to clarify, the idea is, well, how do we explain both the fact that these criticisms happen and that they're successful and they take a lot of time to happen? How do we explain the history of moral progress, for example? And the idea there was that, well, we also have deeply ingrained this tendency to challenge existing standards. And you mentioned equality, piety, stewardship of nature, trying to remove suffering. But I mean, like, what these things are, what they amount to, that we've constantly been pressing on those, since Socrates and further back. So yeah, I just like the picture I was getting, maybe I'm just not understanding completely, but it seemed to be very much a preservationist picture. But the reality of like history, to me anyway, is, yeah, there's a lot of preservation pressure, but a lot of anti-preservation pressure and challenges to orthodoxy. And surely if it were just a numbers game, I mean, we wouldn't see as much of that. That's the idea.
I see. Yeah, so, and it would definitely, this would definitely be helped with some actual facts about sociology.
So Andrew, I have a quick question. Is your question directly connected to what was just being discussed, or?
I had two questions. One was not, but then I feel free to piggyback.
Yeah, so this is just, it was more, if this is a helpful way of thinking about it, because I think you're right, Pamela, but then maybe it's counterintuitive, because we want, like, if you look at this in terms of burden of proof, we want the burden of proof to work in such a way somehow that the burden's on the people that are in the wrong. So if the status quo is slavery and slavery's wrong, somehow we don't want the abolitionists to have the burden of proof. Like somehow that gets the burden of proof wrong. But instead, on this view, it's always going to be the underdog or the minority has the dirty work to do, just by definition, given the picture that that Strawson's portraying. And you might just say, well, that's just the sorry state that we're in, which of course it is. I mean, it's aspirational insofar as you're trying to paint a picture of how to make progress within that. But it does, I mean, there's like no way of, unless you're doing sort of pristine, the worst kind of ideal theorizing, it just turns out that this is the way the burden works in the world. And so moral progress, like Daniel was just talking, it is operated precisely because the people who are already disenfranchised are somehow having to assume even more responsibility to alleviate their own burdens. But this gives, so I guess it is pessimistic in some sense, but it still, to me, seems aspirational. So it is a sorry state that's the basic condition, but it's still a framework that makes the shifts possible. So anyway, I wondered, it was just more about, if I think about it, burden of proof, I can see why people find it not gratifying. But I also think that there's an important like kernel of truth that makes it more hopeful. Maybe I'm guardedly optimistic. You used animal welfare as like one clear example of that, I think, but you could pick obviously lots of others. Anyway, so that wasn't so much a question. It was more just, I was thinking about this earlier when you were talking about it, and then Daniel's question made me think about it again, but yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I want to be careful because I mean, I'm foisting upon Strawson things that I think will help him, but you know, this isn't his. I'm not sure. I'm not exactly sure what he would think about this pressure counter pressure picture, but I mean, there is something about. So I do suspect that something like fairness has a special place in this dynamic, though I haven't sorted out to my satisfaction how to say that. But it's also the case that, you know, the pressure to conform is coming from what I was calling our form of sociability and our the limit, the fact that our capacity for conflict is limited, the fact that our capacity for this sort of emotional drama is limited. But when it's your own interests or your own self-worth that's on the line, that's going to give you a bit more capacity to sustain that drama, right? So, so in a way, the equality fight is in some way more fueled on this kind of picture than the animal torture fight, right?
Yeah,
because
right.
It's like your own standing that you're fighting for in the one case.
Okay, sorry, sorry, Andrew, I didn't mean to skip. It was really just, it was something since it was directly tied to this notion of the burden, I've been thinking about quite a bit lately anyway, where the burden is supposed to be situated. And I think that what you said strikes me as right. And then in this way, that's the part of Strawson I like. But yeah, so Andrew, you said you had 2 questions. These will be the last 2 questions, and then we'll call it a night.
Yeah, sure. So thank you very much. I enjoyed the talk. Yeah, the first one is, I guess, a clarificatory question about like whether we can get, and you may have touched on this, whether we can get critical purchase on the ideals themselves. You know, I'm thinking about a case in which maybe there's some moral reformer who comes along and they appeal to these ideals, but from like kind of an outside perspective, the change that they are arguing for, which might well gain purchase, would be something we'd want to call a bad change. And so is there room in the picture to criticize those kind, like the ideals themselves, like a meta from a meta ideal?
Well, I mean, I think the ideals are just going to criticize one another, right? I mean, so, you know, if somebody comes in and says, well, I have an ideal of, you know, Plato's ideal of the harmonious society, right? Which involves caste, right? Which involves like fixed features of people. And you might think, well, there's one ideal, namely the harmony of it, but here's another ideal, equality of opportunity. Now we just have to like talk out those ideals, and we may or may not come to an agreement about them. The thing that I resist, though I don't have to resist it for this paper, is thinking that we're going to settle those disputes by appeal to metaphysics. So that tends to be the way in which metaphysics or some version of ethical theory that bottoms out in, you know, the nature of the rational will, or the you know, so that's where I tend to think, you know, if you want to argue for an ideal, tell me about the ideal. Don't tell me about other things that are supposed to be the reason why I have to agree with the ideal. Like the best argument for the ideal is restating the ideal or painting it, or like let's bring in the artists and the novelists to get that story going. But that's this paper doesn't need that point, but that explains why I just stop at ideals and I don't go on to say, you know, oh, we can do this because, you know, we can deduce the need for acting out of the motive of duty from the very possibility of a rational creature because or we can look to the fact of God's nature to tell us what the, you know, or what have you. That's why I don't go that route.
Okay, and then I guess just one quick question then is the picture with respect to like the accessibility of the ideals, is it an unobjectionable form of relativism or not a form of relativism?
Neither, I want to say. I mean, so I think there's non-objectionable forms of relativism, namely the way in which the standards of regard can adjust to given populations, either for cultural reasons or for reasons of, the capacities of those populations. Then there would be the objectionable relativism, which would say all we can talk about is the mores of a given society, given this, it's all ethics by poll or ethics by survey, right? So it's not that. It's like, no, I'm just helping myself to these ideals. But in saying I'm just helping myself to the ideals, there's some things I'm not doing. I'm not answering which are the correct ones. I'm not addressing the moral skeptic, right? If somebody's just like, I hate all your ideals, try to make me different, I'll just be like, yeah, okay, I don't know how to talk to you. And I'm not saying like why I have the one true religion, other than trying to tell you about my religion and what's so great about it. So.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And then last question, if I have time, just a quick question. I'm curious about your interpretation of Strawson. So when he mentions the exemption being unfortunate and informative circumstances, do you interpret him as suggesting a genuinely historical condition on responsibility? Or perhaps maybe it's like an epistemic historical condition on responsibility, right? Like, it seems to me that quality of will theories are most naturally construed as ahistorical theories. And so that remark by him has always kind of puzzled me. Like, shouldn't matter how you came to have the quality of will that you have. What matters is the quality of will. But
right.
I'm just curious what you think there.
Yeah, it's a good question. So, I mean, I do think he has in mind, the incorrigible jackass or the sorry, let me. So like this question occupied me a lot in the book, but I stuck it all in footnotes. There's like this running set of footnotes through the book. So it's an upshot of the Strawson view that I think that in the end I think is a feature, not a bug. That there's not a deep difference between the jackass and the person who is mentally ill. Right, the person. So whether your incapacity for ordinary interpersonal relationships is that you're, psychologically abnormal, which is a case in which he thinks we naturally fall into the objective attitudes, or a case in which, you're just such a pain in the ass that we can't deal with you, which is we use our resource. I don't think like that seems to me like it's going to be there's not going to be like a sharp line there because how we interact with you is the same, right? In the one case, we've got a pathology. In the other case, we have a failure of moral development. We can talk about those differences, but in the end, I don't think that the view like requires a real sharp line there. And I have come to think that that's that the fact that vice and pathology are not sharply delineated is actually a benefit of the view rather than a cost to it.
Thank you.
Okay, well, Pamela, that was amazing. Thank you for your time and energy. It's 8:30, so we have already taken up enough of your evening or your afternoon in this case. But I greatly appreciate you joining everybody tonight. The talk was great. Now you've got me wanting to go back and reread this paper again. I was hoping maybe to avoid having to reread this paper, but maybe I'll reread this again. And then when do you think your book will be available?
Oh, I'm actually giving Gifford lectures in November, and then I'm going to make it into a book. So, you mean my Strawson book, or my Strawson book's been published? So that was out in 2020. but I'm working on this big book that's going to be
Yeah,
out,
that's the one I was talking about was the book that's coming out.
yeah, so hopefully a year from now.
Amazing. All right.
That's-
Well,
yeah.
thanks a lot, and have a great evening, everybody, and thanks for showing up.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you. This was really fun.
Oh yeah, thanks. Bye. Thanks again. How are you?
All right, how are you? That is me in a very noisy burger job.
I'm not going to be able to talk long. My mom's in town. It's her birthday. I'm getting ready to leave here to go to her hotel.
Yeah,
So where are you at right now?
I'm in Auckland at a burger joint. I just went to the US consulate. I just got my visa approved.
Oh yeah, that's what you
So,
said. I didn't know if you were there or
Yeah.
here, stateside.
Oh yeah, no, I'm in New Zealand. I'm just in another city that I'm.
And then
Auckland,
when do you move?
August 1st is the date. Yeah,
Dude, amazing.
yeah, I'm super excited.
Man, I was disappointed that hold on.